Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this speaker session on the future of leadership. My name is Todd Breifogel. I'm zooming in from Denver, Colorado, where it's very early in the morning, but I'm managing director of the executive leadership seminars at the Aspen Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. I'll be joined in a second by our guests, and we look forward to a lively conversation. The Aspen Institute and the Hong Kong Federation of Youth Groups and the Jockey Club Leadership Institute are devoted to creating spaces for reflective discovery. This is more important than ever as we think about the next generation of leaders. We're both organizations, all three organizations are focused on values-based and purpose-driven leaders. And we've been meeting this week to talk about new leadership, globalization, and personal elevation. Many of you would have joined us last week for our opening conversation with Andrew about his leadership journey, his personal journey from finance to the B Corp movement and to thinking about the ways in which business and business leaders can help contribute positively to society. Today, we'll be picking up those same themes as we think about the future of leadership. But our guests will have a lot to say about the way in which social entrepreneurship in particular allows us to work together for a more free, just, and equitable society. So enjoy the conversation. Our journey here is to continue the space for reflection, to be informed, to be inspired, and be challenged. And a special thanks also to all of the support staff who have helped make this possible. It's been wonderful to work with Hannah and Sharon on the Hong Kong side, with Jordan, Dulcie, and Marina on the Aspen side. And let me welcome our guests to the stage so that we can get the conversation going. Good evening, Bonnie. Good afternoon, Peter. And another happy good morning to Carolina. Let me introduce our speakers and we'll get started. Bonnie Chu is the managing director of the Social Investment Consultancy, but was also one of the delegates for the Hong Kong Federation of Youth Group Jockey Club School of Global Leadership in 2017, and is an alumna of the Leadership Institute. She'll be talking a little bit at some point about the way in which these wonderful organizations have contributed to her own leadership journey. Caroline Freire is zooming in from Panama City, where it's only slightly later in the morning than it is here in Denver, Colorado. Carolina is president of Voluntarios de Panama. She's a young global leader of the World Economic Forum and a fellow of the 6th class of the Central American Leadership Initiative as part of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. And good afternoon to Peter Tufano. He's the Peter Moores Dean and Professor of Finance at the Said Business School at Oxford. He's also a professorial fellow at Balliol College, Oxford, and a social entrepreneur. Before joining Oxford, Peter was a faculty member at the Harvard Business School for 22 years. Great to have you all here. And as I said to the panelists before we joined everyone in the main room, we're really aiming for a conversation. The space for reflective discovery doesn't come with serial speeches. So the better the conversation, the less you'll hear from me. But Bonnie, let me start off with you, but a question for everybody in turn. You've devoted a considerable amount of time and energy to applying leadership for the common good. How did this interest come about? How did you develop this sense of commitment?
Thank you, Todd. Great to be here, and very, very honored to share stage with Carolina and Peter. I am born and raised in Hong Kong. I think many of the delegates who will be hearing this are as well. And when you grow up in Hong Kong, well, I'm approaching my 30 now, but kind of having seen Hong Kong grow from a relatively kind of low middle income place to what it is today. But I think my family also lived through the Asian financial crisis. And I remember when I was just around 5 years old, that I already had this recognition that the property market does dictate kind of how we live and, you know, the fortunes of society. So I think kind of from a young age, you do think about all these very big forces, but I do have to credit my education. I went to a Catholic school, and nothing to do with religion, but they do instill a very strong sense of service leadership. We had to always think about the poor, or what more we can do to alleviate some of the sufferings in society. And actually, when I was around 14, I joined, I think, the Hong Kong Federation of Youth Groups. There was a program called Hong Kong 200. So it was 200 kind of aspiring young leaders, and we all had to write an essay about our devotion to Hong Kong. And I would say it's not really something as a 14, 15-year-old that I was very actively thinking about, but it does force me to think about, well, in the hometown that I love and grew up in, what is it that I really wanted to dedicate? You know, long story short, I think that kind of landed me to a path of social entrepreneurship. I ended up studying business in university, didn't find fully what I wanted from business school. Now business education has changed dramatically, I think, you know, to the credit of people like Peter. But I then ended up, I guess, a bit of exposure to social entrepreneurship really as that, using the forces of business to support and change society in very small ways. But yeah, that's really how I guess I've kind of come to where I am today, to really focus on social entrepreneurship and to unlock the power of business to drive social change.
Thank you. Writing the essay at 14 also is an exercise in clarifying values. And one of the things that the delegates, as part of the global seminar this week, have been doing is a series of Aspen readings to help clarify the values by which we make decisions and have those commitments to lead. Carolina, so a combination of social environment and education, Bonnie highlighted. How about you? Is the same similar kind of experience, or tell us your story?
Well, thank you very much, Todd, first of all, for this great invitation, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in. Very similar to Bonnie, though I'm not as young as Bonnie. I think since an early age, I knew that I wanted to dedicate my time, my abilities to improving the state of the world. Similar to Bonnie, that was, I think, came about through life experiences. I grew up in several countries in Latin America, but mostly my experiences come from my home country, Panama, where we grew up in a state of dictatorship and then lived through an invasion in our country. But more than that, witnessing the huge gaps between the rich and the poor. Panama is the second most unequal country in Central America, where more than 20% of the population lives in poverty. And in indigenous areas from which I came yesterday in my work, more than 80% of the population lives in extreme poverty. So we live in a context of very stark inequality. And growing up in that environment, but also having many opportunities, really forms you as an individual in understanding that the challenges are daunting, that they not only require the obviously guarantee of the rights of health and education through government, but through all actors. And so since an early age, volunteering became my outlet, became my way of making a contribution. And now as an adult, I formally support, inspire, motivate, and catalyze other youth to also lend their expertise and their time through volunteering to improving our country.
Thank you. Peter, you and I are the youngest among the group. Tell us a little bit about your journey into social entrepreneurship and also to business education.
Sure. First of all, let me say thank you to you, Todd, for inviting me, and also thanks to the Hong Kong Jockey Club. So as the Dean of Oxford, we do a lot of work with you over the years. I think right now we're on a pause until we can get back to face-to-face. So thank you. Second, an apology. I seem to be having some bandwidth problems. So if I am jerky or whatever, I hope that you can at least hear me.
We can hear you very clearly.
Okay. So I didn't even know the term social entrepreneurship when I started to do what I now know to be social entrepreneurship. some years ago, so I come from a relatively modest background, went to university and then to business school, and then got a PhD and was a faculty member at Harvard Business School, and teaching financial engineering and teaching students how to become extraordinarily wealthy. But I got a call from a roommate from college who asked me, can you help me? Because he was working in South Central Los Angeles, which is, a place called Compton, and they have a lot of financial needs in that community. And so he said, can you help us form a bank? And I asked him what problem he was trying to solve. And that started a journey. I went to, LA. I spent some time with them. I started working with faith-based organizations. In fact, if you look at my CV, you'll see this curious article about faith-based organizations, which looks out of place for a finance professor. What became clear is that we needed a new kind of solution in order to address the issues, the financial service needs of these low-income families. Started working on that and figured I'd write a paper about that and somebody else would do it. But sadly, nobody else did it. So we formed an organization at the time called Doorways to Dreams, or D2DFund.org, in order to try to begin to deliver savings products to low-income families. Figured, well, we'll do this for a little bit, but somebody surely is going to take this over and we'll be out of business. Well, 21 years later, we're still quite in business, sadly, because there are still, and I was just looking at the data this morning. We get monthly data, national data in the US, and there still are kind of a large fraction of Americans who are having, major difficulties managing their money, paying bills, living from paycheck to paycheck. So the work that we do at Build Commonwealth, which is now the new name of the organization, has to do with employee savings plans, prize-linked savings, and a lot of other things. So that's experience one. Experience two, in some sense, is running a business school. Bonnie, I'm sorry the experience you had wasn't the one that I hope my students are having, but a business school is really just a large social enterprise. If you think about double bottom lines, triple bottom lines, we have educational bottom lines, but we also have impact bottom lines. And running Oxford, the reason I came to Oxford after so many years at Harvard was really the ability to run a business school in a different way and to have different objectives at that school. In particular, orient the school around addressing the largest challenges in the world. So that's kind of number two. Number three, actually, my business school tends to be one of the leading business schools when it comes to social entrepreneurship and social impact. We would normally next week hold something called the School World Forum, where we invite a couple of thousand people from around the world to join us. And so this has given me kind of a third perspective on social entrepreneurship. And to be controversial, I think that we have to be careful about social entrepreneurship because I think it runs the risk of conflating means and ends. I think what we're about is social impact. And sometimes we confuse social impact with certain types of organizations, whether they're nonprofits or they're social entrepreneurs. But the example that I sometimes use, we do a lot of work in Africa, is if you flew over Africa at night, you'd see a largely dark continent. That might be solved with social entrepreneurs. It might be solved by corporations. It might be served by public-private partnerships. It might be served by government. So, I guess the journey that we've been on at my school is to, continue to celebrate the work of social entrepreneurs, but broaden this out to recognize that it's really about social impact. So in Hong Kong, for example, we work with, the people who do the biggest mega projects in the country, as we do here in the UK and we do in Australia. So how is it that we can have impact through nonprofits, through social entrepreneurs, through large businesses, through governments, through public-private partnerships? So that's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but that's
thank you. And
social entrepreneurship journey.
And I hope we can come. I hope we can come back to that. But for the moment, but I think it's related. And this is a question to all three. But again, let's sort of move into conversational mode. There's inequality everywhere. And as Peter, as you put it quite boldly, business schools are there to teach us how to be rich. And one of the great privileges, I have to say, of my Aspen work is the opportunity to partner with Peter and the Oxford Site Business School for values-based, purpose-driven leadership programs. But in working with the MBAs there's a sense that they're there because what they want to do is unusual. And so I guess the question is, how unusual are you, the three of you, in the world and among your peers, in pursuing the path that you've pursued? And how much feedback, positive or negative, have you gotten from your colleagues and friends about leaving the business profit track for something else? And Bonnie, you're smiling, which makes me think that there's something top of mind for you.
How unusual. I always see myself as a very normal person, but I think I went to one of the quote-unquote most prestigious business school programs in Hong Kong. It was called Global Business Studies. And I know we might talk a bit more about the idea of globalization later on. But in the study program, I'm the only one who has pursued the path of social impact. Some others are working in development finance, in startups, in arts, but majority have chosen to work in investment banks. I think very much, Peter, what you said, when you go to business school, you're then expected to graduate and be part of the kind of mainstream financial markets. I think over the years, in the beginning, in 2013, when I was about to graduate from my university degree in Hong Kong, I started my social enterprise. I think at that time, my friends thought I was a bit weird. And I also then left Hong Kong to do my master's degree in a completely different subject in international relations. And I came to London. So I think at that time it was people were curious kind of why this person has decided to do this. Why not just, well, as I've been born and raised in Hong Kong, why not just pursue that traditional path? But I always am a firm believer of this idea of going outside your comfort zone. I feel throughout my life, throughout my leadership journey, I've grown the most when I stepped outside of my comfort zone. So I've always constantly tried to stretch myself. And I think now I do get much more, of course, positive recognition from my classmates or from my peers. I think there is a sense, I hope, and I did hear from others as well, that they did feel I was very courageous to take the step of really pursuing what I wanted to do. And I'm hoping that also just setting an example for others, if you have found your passion, if you really want to do something differently, then you can. And finally, just want to say for my family, it's always a constant source of discussion. I think my grandfather still asks my parents today, why doesn't Bonnie just come back to Hong Kong and work in a bank? So he still asks that question after almost 10 years of me embarking on this kind of social impact journey. But my grandmother is a big supporter. She didn't go to formal education. She doesn't read and write, but she somehow gets all that I do. So that is the biggest, I think, recognition for me. And she also understands the idea of CEO. So she asked my
so the title matters.
Yeah, so she does understand, what a CEO is. So yeah, just it brings me a lot of joy, and I hope it's also a way for people to see you don't just have to have a set path. At the end of the day, as my parents say, they just want me to be happy and fulfilled, and I hope everyone also will have the opportunity to fulfill their fullest potential.
And that sense of joy and fulfilling potential echoes something that Andrew Kasoy said last week. He said it took him 5 years to decide to leave finance in order to start the B Corp or the B Lab. It flags something that we've been talking about in the global seminar. How do we weigh internal validation as opposed to external validation? And there are a lot of challenges there. But just curious, Peter, Carolina, courage, internal validation, external validation. How weird are you
I can go next. Thank you, Todd. And thank you, Bonnie, for opening up about your experience. Well, in my case, similar to Bonnie, I kind of had to craft my own path. Like Peter said, towards social impact. I knew that that was the vision. That was what I wanted to do. I didn't know how, when, where I was going to do it. I had a vision of doing it in a macro policy impact area, like working through government and public policy, working in international organizations in the development field, or putting my abilities in the nonprofit world at a more micro scale. So I struggled with that for a long time. And I think I went through all the sectors. I went through government, I went through international organizations where I work also now. I went through the nonprofit world. And in the end, it's kind of a personal reflection. Like Rilke wrote in his book, Letters to a Young Poet, you have to live the questions. In order to find the answers slowly in time, you will come to them. Don't force yourself to understand what you can't understand until you live through those experiences. So that was very important for me in finding this journey towards social impact, of also being patient, trying out different things. And then in a more, in the more like professional world of our work, I think it's also been a journey to find a way for our nonprofit to be understood by the private and the public sector and not be considered so weird. We don't have a legal framework in Panama. I know Colombia and Chile already have it, but we don't have a legal framework for social enterprise and for supporting B Corp type of frameworks. So you either are a business or you are a nonprofit. And we are kind of in the middle, where we definitely are trying to go beyond the philanthropic, donor-based, exclusively donor-based nonprofit model. And that has been a paradigm shift. It has been difficult for business to understand that we can have a fee-for-service model, that we are not primarily based only on donations. And even for businesses that work in corporate social responsibility, that has been a shift for them to understand that nonprofits can be sustainable, that they can have fees for their services. And that has been difficult to understand. And even we have had pushback. So sometimes being a little bit innovative personally and in the field of your work can be considered weird. But I think, and in that way, you will segue into the topic of globalization. But those international trends, like the ones Peter has been working on and pushing those boundaries, ultimately has helped us to pave the way to have that change in our local context.
And thank you for making the connection between weird, which was my word, and innovation, which actually frames the issue really well. You know, the thrust here isn't necessarily that everybody needs to quit their jobs and become social entrepreneurs. Quite the opposite, as Peter was saying. How do we get business, government, social organizations, civil society, social entrepreneurship to work together? And I guess a question again for everybody, has the relationship among those sectors changed over the past couple of years, particularly as a result of the pandemic? Go ahead, Peter.
I'd love to jump in on this. I just wrote something about this. I haven't published it yet or put it on my social media or anything. The title of it's called The Joined Up Jab. And so what it's about, and I think it's a good example, you know, I just got my AstraZeneca vaccine here in the UK. What had to work in order for that to work? Now, I know there's some problems, but, well, you know, you needed science out of an elite institution. That was part of an entrepreneurial organization. But they couldn't produce or manufacture, so they needed a big corporation to do that. But they didn't have the validity to do anything other than if a government certified that the test was any good. In the UK, they also needed the government to distribute the test in the form of the NHS. And you think, job done, but not even close. 750,000 people volunteered in the UK to man those sites and to make sure that it all happened. And you say, okay, that's job done. And that's not enough either, because if a combination of traditional media and social media and, you know, what happens in churches and synagogues and mosques, and at the school gate, people don't have the trust to get the vaccine. It all falls. So in essence, every sector had to work, and the premise here is that they didn't work together. They worked in a side-by-side or a loosely coupled fashion, and that's how we were able to see. And we're still seeing, the ability to have major change, because if you tried to coordinate them all, it would be a complete nightmare, right? So it's this notion of they all have to work, but they work in a very loose coupling manner. And I think that that's not a bad model for a lot of other things, because if you think about, all those various parties, they couldn't even use the same language, let alone figure out how to work together. But as long as we could find different roles for them to play that were complementary, then we could make change.
Well, that brings up the question of new leadership. Given what you just described, does it mean that we need to be thinking about different qualities of leadership, both individually and in a sense in complementary fashion from the different sectors? How are you all thinking about new leadership in this environment?
I can start. I don't see anybody else's mic on, but I will pass off to Bonnie or Carolina, and if not, we can cold call. I think we've
spoken like a true business professor.
I can jump in.
Go ahead, Carolina.
Sure. I think that, in general, but the COVID crisis has also made it more visible that we have in this day and age a crisis of credibility in many institutions, not only in the traditional government sectors, but in all sectors. And I think that leadership in this new context has to be authentic leadership, ethical, moral leadership, empathetic leadership, and inclusive leadership. In a moment where everything is absolutely transparent, everything is seen in social media, everything is public, it's more important than ever that we lead by our values. Because if we are to restore that credibility in individuals and institutions, it's the only way. And in speaking to the young leaders that are seeing us today, and making a connection to our little volunteer world, be the first to show up and be the last one to leave. Lead by example. When we volunteer, we usually wake up at 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning to go do our volunteer work. And, I have to be the one that has to be there first, and I have to be the one that's last to leave. And I have to wear my volunteer t-shirt and show all the solidarity and all the values that I speak about. So leading by example in a very transparent and authentic way, I think is the way forward for leadership in this day and age.
Yeah, with Carolina, and I think what's sticking to my mind is who has been the one defining leadership and what good leadership is. For the past, decade, and I think COVID is calling for a reset of so many things we take for granted, and you also see COVID coinciding with quite a lot of reckonings in different societies. And I mentioned that I moved to the UK kind of back in 2013, and I haven't been back to Hong Kong now for almost 1.5 years because of COVID. But so I've kind of continued to observe what's happening in Hong Kong, but I see, for example, in the UK, the reckonings around Black Lives Matter that started in the US, that has also come over here. And there's a lot of questioning what kind of leadership has brought us to this point in our society that has led to the ruptures in COVID. That has led to mass-scale unemployment, that has led to gig economy workers suffering and frontline nurses suffering, etc. So I think this has prompted re-evaluation of what good leadership looks like. I wouldn't necessarily say they're new leadership, because I think there have always been people who have been having those values, such as empathy, a leader kind of being there at last. I mean, that sounds also a bit religious, you know, like how a lot of traditional religious leaders are always the last ones to leave, and they let their followers kind of enjoy first, right? Those, I think, values have always been there, but they haven't been at the forefront of change. But I think now we see more of that shift. And I've just seen in the UK, for example, that a lot of Black Asian leaders have now been recognized that they haven't been recognized before. So, and of course, there is also a dimension of the workplace that we're in now, and working and managing a remote team, the kind of leadership styles that you would need, and empathy, and being able to support your staff, your team members, not just professionally, but also personally. We see quite a few leaders who have, corporate leaders especially, who have kind of been, what's the right word, been sidelined or been forced to resign because they said a few things about staff should work harder or should not, you know, take care of their family as much or whatnot. So yeah, I do think there's a huge shift in how leadership is being perceived, but I would like to think those leaders have always been there. It's just reset in what we prioritize.
So classic leadership traits, but newly recognized perhaps as newly valuable. And I have to say, all the sponsoring organizations strive to put the human person at the center of what we do. But Bonnie, I'm interested that you invoked a kind of religious analogy, because as we think about being purpose-driven, there is this sense of vocation. Where am I called to serve? And vocation, of course, is a religious term. But both Bonnie and Carolina talked about the importance of values. And a lot of what we've been doing in the Global Summit, the Global Seminar, is just taking time to reflect on what we believe and why we believe it, because the hamster wheel of life doesn't give us much opportunity to do that. And so I wonder, Carolina, Bonnie, and Peter as well, could you reflect a little bit? Well, let me start with Carolina. Could you reflect a little bit on the way in which your Aspen experience as a Central American Leadership Fellow has shaped your understanding of leadership and your sense of vocation?
Thank you, Todd. Yes, definitely. I came to the Central American Leadership Initiative at a crossroads in my life, where I had to leave a position in government because it was at odds with my values. And it was precisely that situation that sparked for me to start my social enterprise, my nonprofit, because I wanted to do something for myself, and I wanted to imbue myself with values in my personal leadership. And so the Aspen experience came at a very important moment in my life, where I was defining like a new route to exercise a values-based leadership. So it definitely helped me to understand, not to have the courage to start a new phase in my life, to exercise leadership in a way that is, that I can accompany that with my values. But it also helped me to understand that there are different ways to exercise leadership throughout your life. And one of them that was interesting for me was leading from behind. You know, we tend to think of leaders as people who are always visible, who are always at the forefront, who are always pushing the boundaries, who have to be the first to start something. But I also learned, and I play this different roles as a leader in my work, in my personal life. There are moments where I don't have to be visible, where I can help other leaders, I can empower other people, I can sustain processes throughout time, and then see the result of my work maybe 10 years later. And so it has taught me that not always I have to be at the forefront, but that I can collaborate, that I can push from behind, and that also, I think another learning experience for me was that sometimes it's not so hard sometimes to begin something and to exercise leadership to set a spark, but to sustain it in time. And leadership requires a lot of perseverance, a lot of staying the course despite obstacles, in order to see something that you dreamt of or that you wanted to do really come to fruition. So it has accompanied me and been with me throughout my leadership journey in order to reflect on these different types of leadership that I have to exercise in different roles in my life.
And do you find that you're still living the questions?
Definitely, all the time. All the time living the questions, because new challenges always surface. And it causes you to reflect, well, okay, I've done this, I'm very happy about it, I've seen results, but what more can I do? What more can I do? And in that, I think that's a spark and a flame that you have to keep alive in your heart. Sometimes you're not going to know exactly, but then in time you'll see the dots connect. But the important thing is to have that flame within you, always asking that question.
Thanks. And Peter, we had a chance to live the questions together in seminar. I had the privilege of having Peter in seminar a couple of years ago, an Aspen seminar. But curious to hear about your journey of living the questions as you've clarified your own values.
Sure. And it's curious when you're running an organization that trains leaders and you're trying to create a value-based curriculum and, you know, all of that. But the thing that sometimes people forget is that you as the leader, you have far fewer people that you can talk to about your own leadership crises. And the more senior you get, that list of people you can talk to gets even rarer. So my leadership journey that led me to Aspen, you know, I had been kind of, as an academic would, you know, reading works of moral philosophy on my own, you know, trying to work, you know, what exactly was this concept of justice, and how would I implement concept Rawls, you know, theory of justice in my organization, or how I talk about our goals, and then looking at some faith-based stuff, and and I was actually in a kind of a pretty intense reading period over a number of years, reflecting on this stuff, not really talking to anybody about it other than intellectually, as one does, because, you know, you don't, you know, unless you have, and I'm blessed to have, you know, a wife of many decades and two really close friends that I can talk to. But apart from that, you know, you don't have a circle of people you can just talk to about these things. And lo and behold, you know, got an invitation to join you, Todd. And you may recall, like, this conversation, I was the older person in the room. And that was great. It was absolutely fabulous. I didn't know anybody. And we had these actually phenomenal conversations about things I hadn't read in a long time, or I'd never read. And I found it incredibly invigorating, which is why, you know, I've insisted that somehow we had to figure out a way, like the Hong Kong Jockey Club and this partnership has done, to bring this way of thinking. And really, it's not about thinking, but about thinking and talking and reflecting, you know, to not just me, but to my whole community. I'm now in a new transition. In 3 months, I stepped down as dean, and I find myself in another period of reflection. You know, reading a lot about, you know, not just this role in somebody's life, but, you know, different kinds of leadership styles when you move in different kinds of organizations. It's different to be the boss of a very relatively hierarchical organization, or at least traditional organization, than some of the things that might lie ahead for me. So, you know, am I living these questions? Absolutely, on a day-to-day basis.
Well, and both Carolina and Peter have highlighted the time horizon for this, that journey of reflection on values and values clarification is never ending, partly because the circumstances change, but also, of course, we change. But Bonnie, you were in the same seats as our audience a couple of years ago as a delegate in the global seminar in 2017. How did that experience shape you and your thinking and living in your leadership journey?
I would say a leadership journey is always evolving, and it's hard sometimes to pinpoint that exact talk has then led to that exact change. And I think, Carolina, you talked about kind of 10-year, you know, as a time horizon. And so, you know, just bearing that in mind, that I think a lot of seeds that have been sown probably I might not immediately realize until a few years later as well. But some of the things that it has really changed me, I think first, I left Hong Kong in 2013, and even though I continue to have work in Hong Kong, and of course my family's there, but I think the global seminar in 2017 really made me reconnect with Hong Kong and other people that I didn't know before, who are also working to support social impact, social justice in Hong Kong. And I think that was also when I actually reflected on some of the issues that I knew I cared a lot about, but never had a chance to do anything, such as ethnic minorities in Hong Kong and how their lives are like and how we can support them further. So I remember, being able to team up with someone else, and we were able to kind of put together some ideas and supported an organization that's doing great work in this area. So, concretely, that allowed me to reconnect with my hometown, because since leaving, my impact has been mainly, in the field of women's empowerment and works across the world. And yes, sometimes it's weird that, actually some of the issues I'm fighting elsewhere are still very live and real in my hometown. And I think the second thing I would say is just being mindful that you always have to challenge yourself. I found it to be a huge privilege that I have great people at Hong Kong Federation of Youth Groups who always stay in touch with me. And, you can get quite busy just running your own organizations and just trying to get things done and not take pause to actually reflect on yourself as a leader, and being able to be in that safe space with other leaders who are reflecting on the same questions. But yeah, I just feel very fortunate that the HKFYG staff, they always tell me when there's a great opportunity, and they gave me the opportunity to attend that seminar, and that just allows you to take a step away from your day-to-day, away from your team, and just really reflect. And I think, Peter, you also remind me the importance of just always having intellectual stimulation and reading from different people, reading from historical authors who can really give us some new ideas and challenge and ourselves the kind of leaders we really want to be.
And you spoke earlier also about that change in perspective on ourselves and on others and on leadership. And thank you all for reflecting on the ways in which your perspectives have been illuminated. To those in the audience, on the right-hand side of your Remo platform, there's a little space for question and answer, and we'll transition in a few minutes. But if you want to start putting your questions and questions to the panel in that box, we'll move to questions from the audience. But Bonnie, if I can come back to something that you said, you talked about the way in which a lot of what we learn are like seeds that are planted, and we don't really know that they're there until they germinate, and that germination may be next week, next month, but years down the road. So as we think about this sense of time, is there advice anyone got along the way that has been especially guiding for you in your journey? This is a question for everybody. And in the global seminar, we read a letter by Chimamanda Adichie giving advice to the next generation. And so I guess it's a two-part question you can take up either end. Was there a seed that was planted in you by someone over the journey that has really germinated in an important way? And as you think about the seeds that you try to plant in others, what are they? I hope that's not too abstract, literary, or metaphorical a question. Go ahead, Peter.
I'll kick off a little bit. It is a lot of question in there, so I'll try to kind of do parts of it if I could. So I'm going to reflect on when I first started my social enterprise 20 years ago. We were in a rush. We thought that we could get stuff done in timeframes of a year or two. Turns out every project we did had a time frame of 7 to 10 years. And it took a while to realize that that was going to be the norm, that anything meaningful, you could get pilots done, you could write papers as an academic about things, but anything meaningful was going to take long periods of time, which is very, uncomfortable if you're just anxious to get stuff done. When I came to Oxford, when I was interviewing for the job, I explained how I'd gotten another 10 years under my belt by that time, that I thought this was a 15-year project, and that I would take it for the first 10. And so the one thing that's quite hard is to think about how you're going to, especially in this area of social impact, how can you create projects that are going to live well beyond your tenure as the CEO or the board member or the dean or whatever, because the projects are big and they're going to last forever. So, and so it's a really complicated set of things because people hold on to their jobs and identify very much with the work that they do. But, if you put the problem first, and I think maybe Carolina used that language, if you put the problem first, then kind of what's your role in this relay team of solving this problem? Who else do you need on this team with you? At what point, and maybe I'm reflecting this way because I'm ready for I'm about to face a transition. How do you hand that baton off to somebody else so that, it's going to work? How do you make yourself so that it's not about you, but it's about the problem? This is, the things, I guess they're very difficult, and you don't even start to think about these when you're at the beginning of projects. But once you acknowledge that these projects are huge, like climate change, nobody can solve climate change. What part of that can we work on in a meaningful way, knowing that we're only going to be able to solve one piece of that, even. So those are some of the thoughts I have right now. In terms of seeds, I reflect a lot on, how it is that I got to where I am now. And it's an interesting set of people, my parents for sure, even though they passed away, decades ago, some teachers. It's amazing how one or two people in your life can have a meaningful impact, even with a conversation or two.
Thank you, Peter. That really resonated with me. And actually, a few weeks ago, I had I transitioned from the social enterprise I set up in 2013. And, I said earlier about how my grandma asked about CEO, the term, because I stepped down as a CEO. And my grandma was a bit confused. Why did she step down as a CEO? So that was why she was asking my parents the question. Well, my grandma doesn't use WhatsApp, so she can't communicate with me directly and always has to ask someone else. But that really, Peter, what you said about this is much bigger than any of us. And I have gone through my own journey, in the beginning when I was feeling quite insecure about, starting this thing and who am I and why would anyone listen to me and support me? And then you get some recognition, like whatever labels, Forbes 30 under 30, and that got you into a cycle where you kind of were distracted a little bit from the original reason why you started it, which is really the passion and wanting to solve the problem. But you get sidetracked by the limelight along the way. And then I really had to catch myself and reminded myself what was it that brought me here to the first place. And I remember an HKFYG staff member who was the youth worker who kind of was the leader of my group when I joined in at 14 years old. His name's William, and he always said to me, and we have this proverb in in Chinese that I'll say in Chinese because some of the audience might recognize it. 饮水思源, which means if you drink the water, you would need to remember the source. So I think kind of there are people like that who really forced me to think back on the why, and that forced me to think about humility, and that made me realize that this social enterprise is really not about me, and my greatest success would be that as the founder, that the social enterprise outlives me and that I'm no longer needed. And, eventually you will want the social enterprise not to be needed either, because the problem would have been addressed. But I think that took quite a lot of, perhaps, I don't know, just trying not to be selfish, and also just interrogating oneself and being okay that all of us would have our own self-interest along the way. But yeah, so I think that was very much kind of some of the things that people said to me that helped me reflect on my own leadership journey, that I think also I really resonated with when Peter talked about his reflections.
It's interesting, you both mentioned passion, but also people and the difficulties, particularly in a leadership position, of having people that you can talk frankly with. And it's interesting also that we tend to think about leadership as entering into the arena, but you both highlighted the ways in which leadership also means knowing when to exit. Carolina, one of the things, and thank you, please, as the audience begins to put questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side. A question that was directed from the audience specifically to you, Carolina, but I think Bonnie's already been addressing it, as has Peter. As you think about that passion, how do you stay connected to the spark? Any advice on staying connected to the spark that got you launched on this journey in the first place?
Well, thank you for the question. And I think much like Peter and Bonnie, there are people that inspire you, readings that inspire you, authors and organizations that inspire you, systems that also inspire you, and that can become models for your personal behavior, for your personal life, and for your endeavors, professional endeavors. I think for me, the spark is maintaining myself always humble and connected to what Bonnie said is the why. I just had an experience yesterday because of my work at the Inter-American Development Bank. I traveled to remote indigenous area here in Panama that, there's no cell phone there, there's no internet, there's no electricity, there's no water, there's nothing. And that is exactly what maintains the spark within me, is coming into contact with the problem that I am trying to solve. We get bogged up in our modern life, in our Zooms, in our in our work that has to be highly measurable, that has to be perfectly designed, and life is not perfectly designed, and the problems are not perfect, don't have a perfect solution. And so being in constant contact with the people, the problems that I'm trying to solve is what really re-energizes me and allows me to continue to think creatively, to continue to question what I'm doing, if I'm doing it correctly, if there's a new way to do it. And that keeps you also intellectually stimulated. So also always going back to the people and the situations that made you want to become a social entrepreneur is, for me, a source of constant inspiration.
Other advice for keeping the spark? I know when I was teaching at the university and having an administrative job, the only way I kept connected to the spark was by continuing to teach. And I have to say, being in seminar, particularly with our delegates this week, whether it's late at night my time or early in the morning my time, has been truly inspiring in helping me sustain the spark. But how have the rest of you kept the spark? And Peter, as you think about transitions, how are you thinking about rekindling the spark, if that's the way you're thinking about it?
Yeah. Well, in terms of keeping the spark, I think Carolina's hit the nail on the head. You got to stay close to the people and the problem. So as dean, I couple of times a week, I just get together with students, in very small groups, 4 or 5 students, and just let them hammer away. And these days, they're not, while they're happy about some things, the pandemic is difficult for students. And, rather than getting that filter through 7 or 8 layers of people, to go right to them is important. When I first started my nonprofit, I'd worked with an organization that in turn was coming out of Saul Alinsky's general approach. And there it's really going to people's houses. And the very beginning of the organization that I founded, that's what we used to do. They're called kitchen meetings. You go to people's kitchens and you'd sit there. And, I, a Harvard professor, sitting with somebody, and I can still remember a conversation where I was talking about money, and the question turned around and said, well, you're asking me about, do I save? Do you save? Why do you save? It was a very personal conversation, which I have missed. Because, the higher, in different parts of your life, you get further and further away from at least those kind of very, visceral, very, in your gut conversations with people. For me, with the year of sabbatical ahead, it's trying to reconnect with some of those conversations.
That sense of that intimate connection to people, and particular people in need, not in the sense that we're better than they are, but the recognition of our common humanity, that we all have needs. A bunch of questions. Did you want to add to that, Peter?
Well, I mean, there's a kind of a trick that I use, not a trick, but I can kind of figure out if I'm losing it or if people around me are losing it. If they describe this population as they, that, what is it, indefinite article, whatever that term is for what
the pronoun, yeah.
Pronoun. I've been in, especially a lot of the work that we do in my nonprofit has to do with low-income families. And the minute somebody starts talking about they, in a certain way, that they lost it, that they're making assumptions about people that are pretty dangerous.
Yeah. So. And I would add to that, in my experience in seminar, there's a sense in which what we do in Aspen, reading these old or new texts, and having deep philosophical conversations, that somehow that's only for the educated. And it's always good to remember that all of us as human beings have deep thoughts about what it is that we value. Right? Peter talked earlier about justice. How do we make sense of justice and apply it in an organization? I've worked with homeless people, with students. I know from my own children, right? You can be 6 years old and have a profound sense of justice and fairness in the world. So how do we, as Hafiz in our poem for tomorrow, you global seminar delegates, we going to do in the world today? Lots of questions coming in. Top of the list, a lot of enthusiasm for the question, have you seen leaders, and this is to everybody, have you seen leaders successfully turn a conventional business into a more impactful one? And the corollary question is, what are the leadership qualities? What was it that made those leaders able to turn a conventional business into one that had more social impact? I guess this is an invitation to brief case studies.
I would love to begin if I could. My boss is a guy named Paul Pullman. So boss in the sense that he's the chair of my board. Paul had come from Procter & Gamble, and then he went after one quick hop to run Unilever. Unilever is a firm that had very strong values, but in some sense, is caught up in the normal competition in their fast-moving consumer goods segment. Paul, I think, is usually credited with making sure with bringing the firm back to a set of values that had been there all along, and really creating what, by many's account, is an organization that is really both at the same time conventional, but really very impactful. Because at the end of the day, they still have to sell soap and shampoo and all these products that we want to use. But the way that he did it, and I think, There's things you can read by Paul and about Paul. But to me, one of the reasons I'm so excited to have him as my boss is because of just that. I run a very traditional, conventional organization in some sense. But how you run that is really important. What is it that makes people succeed, which is the second part of that question? I think you just have to really know what you're trying to accomplish and just stay with it. Because it's so easy to be influenced by external metrics, rankings, how much salary, your graduates make, your stock price performance. You can't ignore those things, as the experience of Danone 2 weeks ago reminds us. But on the other hand, if you only are controlled by those things, well, you're going to be controlled by them. So that's my case study.
So really a focus on the why, but also a focus on the how. And it's related to another question that's come up in the chat. How do you get innovation in an organization? How do you have those new ideas while also remaining anchored in the values? Did you want to comment on that, Carolina? I saw you nodding, so I wasn't sure.
No, definitely. I think that, also, for example, in my case, I've been running a volunteer center for already 10 years. It's a small endeavor, but it's important in our context, in our country. And I'm constantly seeking new ways to innovate and answer that question, what more can we do? In my case, to foster a more inclusive, just society that is more caring as well. Especially for vulnerable populations. And for me, something that has been critical is being tied to international networks of knowledge and experience sharing. We are actively part of the Points of Light Foundation and the International Association for Volunteer Effort, and plugging into those networks has been crucial for us to always bring in new ideas from Asia, from Europe, from Africa, from all over the world, and also share our own that can be useful to others. So that's something very practical that has worked a lot for me.
Thanks. And as you think about innovation, as someone put it in the chat, there's an increasing demand to address social and political issues. And Bonnie mentioned Black Lives Matter, which of course is not just an American issue. How do you think about taking more account of stakeholder engagement in this incredibly complicated world? And as I told my group yesterday in seminar, I was speaking with the chief marketing officer a couple of weeks ago who said, my company was called upon to make a statement about Black Lives Matter. And I knew that I would alienate half of my consumers and half of my employees whatever statement I made. So how do we stay committed to values, address innovation, but then also engage stakeholders in an increasingly polarized climate? I'm living the questions here. If you all have answers for that, then it's worth the price of admission.
I'm happy to have a go, and I would love to hear, especially Peter, because I know Oxford University, but also like business schools around the world are struggling a lot with kind of these issues. I think, well, first of all, as a leader, you can, back to Carolina's point earlier, the only thing you can really do is to be authentic. So if you are just going to say something that you're not really believing in, then people would know, and then the backlash would be worse. And I mean, there are lots of companies right now that are thinking about this issue with maybe being a bit controversial here now, but kind of how a few companies, Western companies, spoke out about the cotton in Xinjiang, and now the media roll over it, and kind of both sides fighting each other. But I think it comes back to, as a leader, your authenticity, the values that you want your company to have. Because your ultimate stakeholders, I think, would first and foremost be your staff, and then your customers, and anything else would be secondary. And thinking also back to bottom line and what really matters. And is the profit bottom line the only thing that matters, or are there other things as well that matter? But of course, it comes back to values, and the answer to that question will be different for different companies, for different leaders. And I think it's a really difficult time for leaders, given the political situation that we find ourselves in. We just have to equip ourselves as much as possible with the knowledge, and try to talk to people with different opinions than ourselves. And I think having a attitude of humility would also get us quite far to resolving some of the different opinions and tensions.
And that's a partial answer to several of the questions that came up in the chat. How do we ensure that we're continuing to grow and develop as leaders? And also what might be the most essential leadership quality? But Peter, since Bonnie called on you, how are you thinking about stakeholder engagement?
Happy to talk about that, but I wanted to follow up directly off of Bonnie's point. And I think the innovation question and the challenges of our time question are actually very related. If you want innovation, then you have to be prepared to let people fail. If you want to try to address the challenges of the time, you have to realize you're going to get it wrong. And that's where the humility comes in. So, you know, my story from 2 weeks ago, we were announcing a relatively minor change in administrative assignments at my school. And you know, this is the kind of thing where I send out an email and say, thank you to so-and-so for playing the role of X, and so-and-so is going to do that role next. To be honest, I don't even write these emails. I approve them and send them out. It turns out that this one, you know, had a man and a woman in it, and they were both described in glowing terms, but different glowing terms. And some of my colleagues pointed this out and said, you know what, this is a microaggression. By the way, you know, whether it was, you know, meant or not meant, you know, this was wrong. And so I had to figure out what to do about that. So they came to me personally, even though the email went out to the whole school. You know, do I tell them, thank you for letting me know about that, and, you know, I'll fix it for next time? Or do I use this as a learning moment? And, you know, not that I'm a great person or anything like that, but I decided, you know, given the world that we live in right now, I better use this as a learning moment. So I sent an email back out to the whole school after this person helped me figure out the right way to say it, and said, you know, here's what the research shows about microaggressions and about inadvertent language. Here's what I did, which clearly could have been done better. You know, we can all be better. It was the best I could do. And I'm going to say something that's fairly, I don't know, controversial, which is, if you're really going to embrace these agendas, you have to be prepared to fail as a leader or as an innovator. You know, I could have had a huge misstep on that and many other things. And I have to be prepared to, you know, if I do, then I do. So that's more than humility. Humility, I think, is about, you know, kind of not bragging. This is really the willingness to accept the fact that, you know, if you don't do it right, there will be consequences for you.
And thank you, Peter, for that. And it addresses another question that came up in the chat. How do leaders inculcate values in an organization, communicate, articulate, and inculcate values? You know, your example goes back to our discussion earlier about the power of example. Interestingly enough, one of the questions that's come up in the chat also is, how can women emerge as stronger leaders in the workplace? So adjacent to the example of your email, Peter, how are you all thinking about leadership and women in the workplace in particular?
It's one of my favorite topics. I would love to also hear from Carolina and, of course, Peter, from the people you have come across. I recently had a small thing just for Peter to think about. I was delivering a business strategy workshop for a client, and they're a women's rights organization. So I had a slide just on what strategy is, and then inadvertently I only quoted from men, because that's only quotes I could find about strategy on the internet. And I think that's very much also the same when it comes to leadership. I remember in business school, we did learn about leadership as part of kind of management study. I couldn't quite remember my reading list now, but I can guarantee that quite a big number of the authors we quoted from are indeed men. And one anecdote from earlier in my social entrepreneurship journey, I had a board member who asked me if his daughter can interview me for her homework assignment. And the homework assignment was feature a leader or a business leader and bring it to the school and talk about it. And apparently I was the only women leader that was featured. And, you know, the school had around 20 students or so. So I think I'm just quoting all those examples just to say that leadership traditionally has not been equated with women. In fact, it's been very much equated with men. And speaking also as a woman growing up in Hong Kong, although we have our head of government who is a woman now, we still see quite a low number of women in politics, in business, and women are subject to different standards in leadership. If you are an assertive leader, then you'll be called bossy. If you are a leader who works too hard, then people will question you, well, are you neglecting your family? How about those traditional ethos of being a good woman? So you just get a lot of those biases. And I think the only thing we can really try to make this shift is for women leaders who now are fortunate enough to find ourselves in positions where we are, to really make sure that we set ourselves as examples to mentor the next generation. If you can't see it, you can't be it, to really change gender norms. But I think, you know, back to our earlier conversation, this is also a time to really have a reset in what we see is leaders are good leaders. And some of the values we talked about earlier, you know, empathy, generosity, whatnot, those are also qualities that women have as much as men. So yeah, I hope it's a time really for us to shift how we think about leadership, and therefore for more women, but also other people who don't fit the traditional box. It's not just women, but you know, people who have different sexual orientation, etc., to people with disabilities. And yeah, it's really broadening this idea of leadership.
That's a lot for leaders to engage. And as someone put in the chat, how can we encourage diversity and inclusion beyond workforce development, but also think about it in respect to the bottom line? We're coming up on time, and I know there are a couple of questions that we've neglected in the chat, but let me flag one of them because there was a lot of interest behind, and I can't imagine a better group of people to answer it. Any advice for people in the finance industry, which was described as primarily interested in money, but would you give some suggestions for people who work in finance, how they can make a little change and benefit to society?
I think not only in finance, but in all sectors that anybody works in, there are definitely changes that you can incorporate on a personal level and in an organizational level. Some of them are to, and like one of the questions in the chat said, as leaders, promote more diverse and inclusive environments in your workplace, be it the financial industry, the nonprofit industry, whatever industry that you work in. I think that's a huge change. That's something that you can actively promote and make more visible. You can also use different instruments for investment, and maybe you might not be yourself engaged in a social enterprise or a nonprofit or a cause, but if there's a passion or a cause that moves you, there's many ways to invest now today. Tools like impact investing and other type of investments that you can make and that you could definitely support.
Thanks. Peter, briefly.
Absolutely. So I've been in the finance industry on the edges for 35 years. There has never been a better time than now to have an impact through finance. You know, Carolina's mentioned it, you know, what happens inside your firms in terms of diversity and inclusion. You know, what kind of deals are financed, you know, whether you bring an ESG lens to what you're thinking about. If you're not happy with the firm that you're in, there are lots of fintechs that are doing really interesting work. You know, in 30, 35 years, this is the best time ever to use finance as an instrument for justice, ever. And you know, you may have to be prepared to say the things that people don't want to hear. So I'm on the board of a financial service firm. And, you know, I'm the director that at every single meeting we talk about ESG, and I kind of say, can't we do better? And I think my fellow directors are getting tired of me, but, you know, like, okay, but I can do that. And you can do that at your level too, you know, just like on this project, how can we do some things differently? So finance is a major force in our economies, and you can make it a better force for good.
Thank you. And as we go towards a wrap up, a question that the folks in the networking session that follows will be answering for themselves, but I'll pose it to all of you. What's the leadership question at the moment? What's the leadership question that's not being asked? As you think about the world in which we live and the time horizon, the Hong Kong Federation of Youth Groups is about 50 years old. The Aspen Institute is 70 years old. What's the question we're not asking ourselves as leaders that we need to be asking ourselves as we think about the next 50 or 70 years? We're living the questions here, folks.
I think from my side, from what we observe in the world, and Peter talked about the publication that he's gonna publish soon about different sectors coming together to solve a problem. And I think that maybe one of the questions that we're not asking in the world is, how are we going to come together to try to solve some of the world's most pressing problems? We have forums, we have international organizations, forums, cooperation agreements. We have all sorts of structures and institutions to foster cooperation. But within our own nation states, that cooperation has to strengthen itself. And we have to recognize that it's not the other who is going to solve the problem, it's that we are going to solve the problem. And we, as leaders of different organizations and institutions, play a big part in fostering this collaboration. It's not only about individual accomplishments, organizational accomplishments, but societal accomplishments. And that's one question that I don't see very much. We tend to become more polarized in the world within our own national societies, but we're not asking how we're going to come together to solve the problems.
Thank you.
Can I do a +1 on Carolina's comment? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
You know, so the thing that I think characterizes most business school curricula is they think about, you know, individuals, teams, and organizations. But what we have to do is to have people understand the next level up, understand how systems work, but also how they're going to become system leaders. And, you know, in a group like this, or, you know, in my school, it may seem, oh yeah, this is natural. Not so much in the bigger, broader world. People are still thinking about their individuals, their teams, their organizations. And it's complicated because some of the things you're asking them to do are anti-competitive or pre-competitive, for example, if they're working with competitors, or they're actually working across boundaries that have historically looked at each other with great skepticism at best. So how is it that we not only allow people to be successful in their teams and organizations, but we give them a little bit of tools so that they can work in a loose way? And I go back to in a loose way across boundaries.
Thank you. Bonnie, you get the last word. What's the question we're not asking?
Yeah, well, I'll be cheeky and say 2 quick questions. Is leadership is leadership just about the leaders? So I feel it has traditionally just be about the people who are so-called leaders, but is the concept of leadership actually much wider? And within that is, how can we really grapple with ego as a concept that is a blockage perhaps to those leaders, and this concept of leadership doing more for social impact?
But let me say just a word of thanks to Bonnie and Peter and Carolina, especially Carolina for getting up so early in the morning to be with us, and Bonnie and Peter for spending part of what I'm sure from the background looks like a very sunny afternoon in the UK. But thanks for living the questions together in the company of the people who are watching. I'll recur to something that Walter Pepke, the founder of the Aspen Institute, said. He said, "There are a lot of things to be uncertain about, but of this I am sure. The complications of business in society have never been greater. The need for leadership in business has never been more demanding. The opportunity for leadership from business has never been so open to us." He wrote that in 1951, 70 years ago. And you've heard from the conversation today that never have the complications of business in society been more. Never have we had more of a need for leadership in business, and never has more been required from business. And as we think about the next 70 years, thank you to the three of you for offering so much of your minds, but also so much of your hearts as we think about the future of leadership in a globalized world. We will adjourn, and thank you once again to our speakers. Thanks to the various teams that have made this possible. And thank you to all of you in the audience for your attention and for your lively questions in the Q&A.
Thank you.